evening. Thank you all for tuning in. I wanted to introduce you all to my friend Cliff. He has been out of the organization for about 8 months and recently posted a video telling his story on YouTube. And I will link to his channel in my description below. Highly recommend it. It was a great story. I was riveted for the whole thing. It's an hour long, but I couldn't take my eyes away. I mean, it was a great story, and I found it extremely encouraging. So I reached out to you right away, Cliff. Would you mind just kind of telling an abbreviated version of that story for us now?
Right, absolutely. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me on your channel. I've seen some of the videos that you've done, and very impressed with how you break everything down. So it's definitely an honor to be on with you. So an abbreviated version of my story, my history with Jehovah's Witnesses. I was born into a family of baptized Jehovah's Witnesses, 3 older siblings that were also baptized or born into that family of baptized parents. I was a baptized witness by the time I was 9. I began associating with a Spanish congregation by the time I was 15, moved over at 17, and was in the Spanish congregation for 8 years. During that time, I also had the opportunity to serve at Bethel and pioneered basically throughout that entire time when I wasn't at Bethel. By 25, I moved to the Portuguese congregation. And it was right around that time when I began to slowly have questions about a lot of the things that I had been learning my whole life, essentially.
Right. So you had a stretch of a few years there where things were just starting to not add up?
Absolutely. Yeah. So basically, I had a friend about 3 years before I actually left the organization that disassociated herself and decided that she no longer believed it was the truth. So that was kind of the first time I gave myself permission, so to speak, to actually consider that as a possibility. Because prior to that, any of the questions that I had, I didn't allow myself to view them in the light of a possible reason as to why this is not the truth. It was more a deficiency or a defect on my part.
Right.
So that's what really changed things for me.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. You have these thoughts coming up, but who are you to ask the questions? Because, as we've been told a million times, if God and Jesus trust the faithful and discreet slave, who are you to question it? So the problem must be with you, right? But then certain, chinks in the armor start to show through, and you had a few of those that you mentioned in the video. Or maybe it isn't just me.
Exactly.
What I wanted to talk about today was the things that you and I experienced right towards the end that kind of helped push us out the door. Because leaving an organization like this obviously is not easy. I mean, you know that your family are being held hostage if you ever leave. So when those doubts enter your mind, you push them down because you don't want to lose your family. I mean, that's not a thought that you're willing to entertain. So for a while, I've had the sense that for those of us that leave, most of us require some kind of catalyst. And I should be clear that when I say those of us that leave, I mean those of us that leave mentally, really leave the organization and no longer identify as one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Correct.
For our whole life, we heard rhetoric about people being stumbled. There might be somebody that you haven't seen at the meetings for a while, and it's like, oh, so-and-so is stumbled. And so that's I think, one of the catalysts that often works for people, where they can kind of start to face the doubts that were already there. It might be just a conflict with somebody in the congregation, or it could be something more serious like the mishandling of child abuse. If you have a family member that was abused and it's not handled in a way that really shows care for that child, that can make you question, is this really God's organization? And I think in probably most cases where people leave, that's a final straw rather than just the beginning. Now, if it's just the beginning, I have no problem with that either. But I think for many of us that actually really do completely unplug, it was a long process. And for both of us, it was years leading up to it. Would you mind, I've been talking for a while here now, would you mind telling your story just kind of briefly about what happened at the end that kind of got you out the door, and then I'll share my experience?
Sure, absolutely. So, as I said, for a few years, especially from the moment that my friend left the organization, disassociated herself, I was having doubts consistently, but I just tried to continue staying busy with the privileges I had in the congregation, pushed them in the back of my mind. I ended up seeing the Jeffrey Jackson testimony on the Australian Royal Commission, ended up having another friend who had a very high position in the organization. He ended up walking away. So again, as those things began to happen, the doubts became such that I could no longer ignore them. And so I definitely got depressed, extremely sad and scared at the prospect that this is not the truth. I'm a Jehovah's Witness. That's it. If I'm not a Jehovah's Witness, really, what am I? Or, what's the purpose? What do I bring to this earth? And that's kind of a scary thought, especially, me questioning God at that point and saying like, okay, I don't even know if I feel comfortable praying to him because I'm unsure. And that being such a difference from how I lived my whole life up until that point. So basically, I got to a point where I no longer qualified to serve in the congregation as a servant and a pioneer, which is what I was doing in the foreign language and Portuguese congregation, because I'd had some indiscretions with a member of opposite sex that I came forward about and told the elders. Wasn't anything judicial, but it did mean that I wasn't exemplary and could no longer serve.
Sure.
But once that happened, I was forced, because now I had so much time on my hands because of not handling all of these assignments, not going on service quite as much. I finally was forced, because of the time that I had, to actually deal with these doubts. And the minute that I got that time and started to actually process them and think about everything over the years that I had trouble with, I came to no other conclusion, but I don't actually believe this. At that point, I stopped going to the meetings for a couple of months, and I did end up getting involved with this girl that I began seeing. And so, at that point, we were hanging out and was no longer living a witness lifestyle. So basically, I tried to give it another chance. My father convinced me that maybe the reason that I really wanted to get out was just to sin, or maybe I just felt lonely and really wanted to, be married. And because of what we're always taught, that that is one of the only reasons that someone would ever leave Jehovah's Witnesses is because they just really want to sin or something like that, I bought into that. And I said, okay, maybe he's right. Maybe my dad is right. Maybe all I want to do is sin, and that's not worth giving up my relationship with Jehovah. So let me go talk to the elders about what I've already done and try to, work my way back. So that was how I ended up. And it was determined that, I would be disfellowshipped once I, came forward about the things that I had been doing with the girl I had been talking to up to that point.
Okay, so it sounds like a big key, a shift was when all of a sudden you didn't have so much to do to keep you on track.
Absolutely.
The organization tries to keep people so busy that they don't have time to doubt. And they really had you, run ragged. And to have this indiscretion, as you put it, was the thing you needed to be able to face those things you had had a growing awareness of for several years.
Exactly.
Now I'm going to share my story. It's I have a hard time talking about it, and I haven't brought it up on my channel before, but I had a catalyst as well. So I was married for 12 years, and I don't want to say too much about the nature or quality of my marriage, but there were problems. And I attribute some of those problems to issues of sexual repression related to the way the organization gets people to think, and the fact that there is no premarital sex permitted within the organization. So marriage is going to be a surprise for anybody, but I think a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses don't understand what they're getting into when they get married. And I would say that was the case with me. So in addition to having years of doubts growing like you, I was also having years of realizing that my marriage was problematic, and it was emotionally difficult on some levels. And there was a lot of distance growing within the marriage. And at some point, I met somebody online, a member of the opposite sex. I never met this person face to face, but this relationship started innocently and then developed into what I would say was at least emotional infidelity. And I had a lot of guilt about it, and we would break off this relationship, and I would cry like a baby, and we would end up getting back together. And this happened numerous times. And in retrospect, when I look back on this, having such an intense attachment with somebody I'd never met before, I think the catalyst was starting. It was the pushing out the door that was happening. This is possibly a ticket to freedom. That they're getting a glimpse that there actually could be a different life that doesn't involve being in this organization with somebody who's very indoctrinated. It just reached a point eventually where we had broken up again, and we had a Skype conversation, and I told her that I was in a bad religion. And I had never verbalized anything like that before. And that was the beginning of the end. The next day, I found JW Facts and did tons and tons of research. And any guilt feelings that I had about this relationship ended at that point, because I was thinking very clearly about my exit now, that really this religion, all the doubts that I had about this religion have been verified. And so then it was just a matter of planning the exit. Now that's a whole nother conversation about how the exit happened. I have regrets around it. My ex-wife suffered a lot, which is probably inevitable when there's a divorce. But if there was a period of guilt and shame that I had to deal with for a good 6 to 9 months after it all. And I can't say I'm proud of it, but I can say that relationship was the catalyst I needed to admit what I had known deep down for so long. That relationship was not a long-lasting relationship. It ended within a couple weeks after my exit, but I'm so thankful that it happened, because that relationship made it possible for me to, I'm starting to repeat myself here, but it made it possible for me to admit what I knew deep down.
Right.
So that's my story. Now, the way this is perceived by Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, is, as you mentioned, we just wanted to sin. This was all about just wanting to sin. What's interesting is that kind of rhetoric isn't unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. Ex-Mormons are told the same thing, that the reason you left the church is just because you want to sin. I'll put another link in the description for an article entitled 15 Things Ex-Mormons Are Tired of Hearing. And the first one on the list is, you were offended / you wanted to sin. So this is perfectly in keeping with what Stephen Hessen talks about in the BITE model. Under emotional control, if you go to freedomofmind.com, I'll put the link for this in there too. emotional control number 8, it says, there's never a legitimate reason to leave. Those who leave are weak, undisciplined, unspiritual, worldly, brainwashed by family or counselor, or seduced by money, sex, or rock and roll. And I think that's probably the big one with Jehovah's Witnesses. There was an article that you mentioned that kind of emphasized, or no, it was the brochure. Do you have that handy?
Absolutely. So the Return to Jehovah brochure, I believe that came out, it may have been last year or the year before, but I'm sure everyone is familiar with that. It's a brochure aimed at people who have left the organization, whether they be inactive ones or people that are disassociated or disfellowshipped. And it's very interesting to me that as you read this brochure, which I did because, when it came out, I was still a witness at the time. It doesn't mention the reason why most of us, like you and I included, are really out and continue to stay out of the organization. Because we've done our research, we've discovered the history, and we realized that it is based on lies and that the deception continues to our day. If you look at the Return to Jehovah brochure, the only things that it addresses as to reasons why an individual would ever leave Jehovah's Witnesses is, for example, in chapter 2, it says anxiety, hard pressed in every way. And it talks about basically being overwhelmed with all of your responsibilities, maybe family responsibilities, in addition to everything you have to do as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, maybe your privileges, and you just got burned out, right? So that's supposedly one understandable reason as to why you would leave. Chapter 3 says hurt feelings, when we have cause for complaint. This is when you're just acting like a child because somebody looked at you wrong at the Kingdom Hall.
Right.
And that's enough for you to turn your back on this organization that's the truth, supposedly.
Yep.
Right? And a lot of other things along those same lines. Number 4 says guilt, cleanse me from my sin. The same thing that you just referenced. I just feel so guilty because I'm sinning or, I keep committing immorality or I'm living with somebody or something. And I feel like either Jehovah would never accept me back because I'm just too far gone, or maybe I lack the self-control to stop doing those things. Mm. In nowhere in this brochure does it mention the reason that we have now come to know why there is such a large ExJW community. Vast majority of the time, it has nothing to do with the reasons that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I found that interesting.
And I think it's really important to draw a distinction between people that are being disciplined for sin and those who no longer identify as Jehovah's Witnesses. So, do you know anybody that is an ex-Jehovah's Witness do you know anybody who's disfellowshipped who still thinks like a Jehovah's Witness?
So very funny you said that. To be honest, the only people that I know that are disfellowshipped that don't think like that are people that I've met online, the YouTube and, the ExJW community. There are as soon as I got disfellowshipped, there were probably 6 or 7 people that I just called because I didn't know who else called. Like, they're out, I'm out. That's going to be my social network. And even since I've been disfellowshipped, ironically, and I hadn't even mentioned this to you previously, probably the only person that I helped to the point of baptism, he got disfellowshipped a few months ago. And he's been talking to me. But the point is, every single one of these disfellowshipped individuals that I have somewhat of a relationship with are still completely indoctrinated. Yeah. There's not a doubt in their mind that this is the truth. And when I began, I don't necessarily preach all of the things that I know now about, the falsehoods of the organization. But sometimes they'll say, hey, did you go to your assembly this month or this year? Or, what's the meetings been like? And I'm like, I'm not going. And then they dig and I tell them and they will get very defensive and they'll say, how can you say this is not the truth? What other organization, even if all the things that you're saying is right, what other organization shows love, which Jesus said would be the identifying mark of his disciples, and they're still going. But what's very interesting about these people is they're not stopping their behavior. They're still doing all of the things that will completely disqualify them from ever getting reinstated if they were honest about those things, which I believe they were. And they're just still out, and they just there's no indication as to when they might come back. So that must be, some kind of prison. Practicing sin, if you will, feeling that it's wrong. Every time you do something, you're like, okay, Jehovah's going to destroy me, and I need to go back to this place, but I can't build up the discipline to do it. So as you said, that there's a very big difference between just being out and really being out mentally, to where you're no longer indoctrinated.
Yeah, I think it shows that the two things really aren't related.
Right.
A person might have a sin that is a catalyst for them to admit the thing they always knew. That's entirely different than the person who sins and still completely believes for years and years. And that's, I think, something that Jehovah's Witnesses don't understand. I know I didn't as a Jehovah's Witness. When I was really believing, I bought into this idea that everybody that leaves is everybody that claims to not believe would be trying to justify their behavior. But when we look at examples like your friends you mentioned, and I know some like this too, that really doesn't add up. It's two separate issues.
Right.
I have a video where I talk about fear of the unforgivable sin. In that video, I talk about different categories of Jehovah's Witnesses, and one of the categories I mentioned are people that are out and still indoctrinated, and that I agree that this is an incredibly sad state to be in. I can't imagine it, because you're convinced you're going to die at Armageddon, unless you can get your life in order. And that's just no way to live, But it shows that even that kind of motivation, the motivation of you're going to die at Armageddon, still isn't enough to wake people up. So I think the desire to just want to sin, that's not the thing. That's not the thing that wakes people up. They're just going to keep feeling guilty. There has to be some kind of additional layer of what I would call courage, intellectual honesty, and humility to get to that place where you can say, it's not true.
Right.
None of this is real.
Mm-hmm.
And I commend you for having that kind of intellectual honesty and humility and courage to face the facts. Admit that you were duped for your whole life. That's not an easy thing to do. So congratulations.
It's nice to be on this side.
Yeah.
I was just going to add to what you're saying, as far as, having the courage and being intellectually honest. I think all you really need is to at least get to the point of researching. Because once you research, in my opinion, I can't think of anybody who's done all the research and is still saying, yeah, this is still the truth. There may be some, but I'm sure it's the minority. Yeah. So for example, once I started doing the research, it took me like 2 months after being disfellowshipped to finally say, okay, I'm not sure it's the truth, but I need to do this research. Once I did the research, now I'm completely out. Right. So I think that's a very important first step. That if you can just get to that point, I think, likelihood is that you're home free.
I tend to agree, but I do think that it requires a first step of intellectual honesty that predates the research. I think that if you're confronted with, an apostate website just out of the blue, your blinders are going to go up and you're not going to see it for what it is.
Right.
I do think that you have to do some of the work internally first. And I certainly got that sense from you. You had essentially worked it out before you actually did the research. That it was crumbling long before then. And once you get to that point, the research just becomes the thing that tells you, in case you were worried, you're not crazy. You're not crazy. So I want to add to what she said. If there's anybody watching this that isn't sure, research. If you're new to all of this, questioning for the first time, that's the most important thing you can do, and do it until you believe it, until you own it. This is not reverse brainwashing. This is facing reality. But that's not easy to do when you have been, under that undue influence for so long. That creates those really deep ruts in your brain. So research is absolutely key.
Definitely. That's an excellent point. I agree.
All right. Do you have any other thoughts you wanted to share?
No, I think that's what I pretty much wanted to share.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your doing this with me. I've been wanting to address this subject of needing a catalyst and kind of sharing a little bit more details about my story, and you helped give me the context to do that, so I really appreciate it. I want to mention your channel. It's the name of the channel is Fifth, and I will again put the link in the description for your video. I'm hoping that we get to see more videos from you, but even if that's the one video you do, you've done a great service to the ex-Jehovah's Witness community and doubting Jehovah's Witnesses and people that have family members that are studying. I mean, you're going to hear all kinds of people that express appreciation for what you've done. So thank you from me and from them, and thank you for taking the time this evening.
Yes, not a problem. Definitely, again, like I said, it was my honor, and definitely overwhelmed by the responses on the video so far. I wasn't expecting that, but it just goes to show, that we're all helping one another. The same way that I've been helped by videos I've seen, hopefully mine will do the same for someone else. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. All right, have a good night.
You too.
And thank you all for watching.